Hey everyone, welcome to the Leadership Podcast. I'm Will Atkins with your hosts, your co-hosts, Dion, Thea, and Brett. And this is the podcast where our disagreements can help inform your decisions. And today we're talking about the role of the government in disaster response. This is in response to things like the wildfires in California, the hurricanes in Florida, all of those types of things. So, Dion, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I will admit that normally I have a plethora of notes, and if you guys took a look at the document today, you'll see one link that I put in there. I did not prepare as well as I normally do, but that's okay. I think part of what we have been discussing among us has been like what we want to do with this show. And I think for our listeners and viewers, it's maybe a little bit important to kind of talk about how we all have full-time jobs. And so we kind of discussed among us that trying to keep up, especially with this administration, which is just going really fast with a lot of things. It's just not something that we can reasonably do and do a good job at it. So I don't think that's going to be our focus for this podcast. And I don't think that's what we necessarily want to focus on. So we want to kind of talk about the broader topics and we'll try to make them relate to what's going on. But it's hard enough watching like CNN and Fox News and everybody try to keep up with everything that's going on. And that's their full-time job to do it. So anyways, all that to say, a lot of this revolves around FEMA, right? Because that's kind of the forward-facing element. It's not the only one, because we can talk about the National Guard and even the DoD, Army Corps of Engineers and things. They get involved as well, but probably the most prominent one is FEMA. And there was talk from Trump at least a few days ago, I think, as of our recording of this podcast, where he kind of casually mentioned, and I'm considering maybe getting rid of FEMA, right? And so I'm sure a lot of people went, what the heck? Okay. So again, getting back a little bit to the roots of our podcast, as a libertarian, the Libertarian Party, their stance would be, yeah, absolutely, axe it all, cut all of it. We don't need it. We can do something else with our tax money, and we can do it better. Me personally, I would say maybe I'm 50-50 on that. I would like to say that, well, so first off, I think we can all agree that there is no 100% efficient government agency, right? They all could do better. And so in that way, I would say, yes, absolutely. We probably could make cuts, make changes and things, and we would all be better off for it. On the other hand, there are certain things the federal government does do reasonably well when you take into account the size and scope of what they're trying to do. And I do have a tendency to think that disaster response is one of those places where the full weight and might of the federal government should be an asset to the American people. But it's also a place where recently I feel like they've maybe fallen short. So I might actually ask Thea about her opinion on the response to the LA wildfires. That's the most recent one. And maybe kind of talk to us, because I was thinking about how, well, in Los Angeles, you've got a Democrat mayor, you've got a Democrat city council, you've got a Democrat legislature at the state, and you've got a Democrat governor. So hypothetically, any barriers that you would have to getting done what you want to get done in that state and in that city should be at least not political, right? Like all the political willpower should be aligned there. So maybe you can talk to us about whether you thought that disaster response went well or not.
So, yeah, I think it's interesting. Obviously, the fires put things like in real time. And one of the things that has been going on or has been happening almost immediately after the fires is that I got a number of emails from organizations that were looking for lawyers to immediately help fire victims to try to navigate the insurance process and figuring out how they can file their claims, get relief, work with FEMA, all of that. People were looking for lawyers. I mean, I'm talking while the fires were still going on, and it's definitely, I'm still getting the emails now. And I now have friends that are actually working in that space and are dedicating their time to try to help people. And so it's brought me back to kind of thinking about who has the ability, like who has the resources to come in and address the aftermath of a natural disaster, but also then who can even address it in the immediate aftermath and then over time, and then what are the different roles that government and private industry should play in this. So I think when you say FEMA, I agree that in the days of the fires, like the first, you're looking to your government to help in the whatever immediate money, whatever immediate assistance. I will say one thing that I was pleasantly surprised by, and I shouldn't say pleasantly surprised by, but one thing that brought me joy and made me happy was to see how seamless the fire departments across the country internationally, how they were able to respond. So, the capacity, even though there are several, like the LA County Fire Department is huge and their capacity is huge, but obviously they were overwhelmed by the fires, and how quickly you saw fire rescue and fire response coming from all across America, coming from other parts of California and coming internationally. It reminded me of being in the military and, seeing how quickly we could mobilize and get to other parts and help when there were disasters. Like I was in when Haiti had the earthquake, and I remember us mobilizing out of Pope to send the 82nd down to assist with that, evacuate that earthquake response. So coming back to your question, I know I'm rambling, but I think that when you're talking about like how do you help the people in the aftermath, that's one conversation. But I think you kind of you spoke to in your question in the immediate, like how do you get government together to respond to the disaster as it's happening? And then working with the federal government to figure out how all the resources allocated. And I think that was where we saw friction with the fires here. And where the fact that there wasn't a smooth or harmonious relationship at every level, because the transition was going on nationally. And then you still had, even between the mayor and the head of the fire department, friction about how did we get here. And then meanwhile, like half the city's burning. So I do think that there was frustration from the point of people where it was like, I don't care. I guess that was the thing that I learned. I don't care why you don't like each other. I don't care. In the moment, I just want to know that the government is doing, and this was at a local level, right? We were at a city, we're talking about city and county, right? Because I think one thing to understand with the fires and to understand about LA, and it comes back to Brett, we talk a lot about like local government and that, that should be the first line of defense. But what we saw here, and I guess I never thought about it, was, so the Palisades is city of LA County, but Altadena and Pasadena, they're their own cities, but still in LA County, right? Hollywood was still is in LA County. So you have all these different cities in the county, but they're in close proximity together. And those fires were jumping across jurisdictions, you know what I mean? And so the response wasn't completely cohesive in that way because you did have different localities like affected. And so I do think it raised the issue of even when you have a united, as far as everybody's a Democrat, in leadership, you still may not have cohesion in response. And so that was something that it kind of brought home to me, that sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with our parties. When the city's burning, people are just looking to the government to respond. And unfortunately, I thought about, well, if we were to eliminate FEMA and we were to privatize it, would we get the response we really need in these moments? And seeing what's happening with the insurance companies, I'm not getting a warm, fuzzy feeling that private industry is the solution. You know what I mean? I feel like like rattled off a bunch of problems without like bringing in solutions, but it's so pertinent to what we've been talking about what do we expect from our government at what level and what's reasonable to expect. And, I think LA has a lot to look at.
With the insurance situation, though, I would say from what I read about it, the insurance situation was exacerbated by California's law that put caps on how much they could charge for premiums and deductibles on homeowners insurance. And so a lot of insurance companies just simply decided that they could no longer afford to do business in certain cities and counties in California because they couldn't charge what it would cost to actually replace that dwelling.
And I think this is not, and Will, feel free to chime in. We're seeing this across the country in different locations that are prone to different types of disasters, right? So you're seeing it being much more difficult to insure homes in parts of Florida, due to the hurricanes. And so you have to balance this. So the problem that you were having in California, that what led to that rule, but we're seeing second, third order effects, is you may have someone who has a home that was built in the 1930s. Let's say it's a family home that's been in the family, and it's, whoever bought that home, built that home, it was worth X amount of dollars, years ago. And now it's worth millions because of where it is, right? And especially if we're talking the Palisades, man, those homes, we're talking $5 million homes burnt. These were some of them were very expensive homes, not everyone. And so the issue became then, if you're passing on that real cost, there's situations where you could have someone who can't afford to insure their home anymore, right? Just because the property value has gone up. Right. So I bought my house in 1980, and now I live there, 40 years later, 50, and 45 years later. And now my insurance premiums are more than everything, that I can't even afford them. So I think that's what it was designed to address. Mm-hmm. But you're right, man, that it's not profitable to have, to insure, because my parents are running into this problem. They live in the desert. Live in Palm Springs, where there's certain restrictions on different types of insurance that they can get on their home. And it's just like, well, what are you going to do? Because now people can't have full coverage insurance. But then if you charge them what it would cost, people can't afford to insure their home. So that's again, people are looking for government to fill the gap.
How do we fix that, though? So it seems like I think you kind of point out a sort of one of these conundrums where the free market's solution would be to charge whatever the market will bear, right? And there will be certain people who simply can't afford it. There may be second or third generation in the house that was perfectly affordable 20 years ago, but because the entirety of the real estate market has ballooned, they would find themselves not being able to afford it. And that obviously, I think any reasonable person would say that is not an ideal solution. But at the same time, then government stepping in and saying, okay, you cannot charge more than this amount. And then the company, they're in business to make money and to answer to their shareholders. And if they're taking a loss on something, they're going to say, well, then I'm not going to sell my product here. And so the government solution doesn't quite work. So how do we fix that?
Well, and it's not,
that's a big one.
It's not always the overall cost, though, either. A lot of times it's the rate of increase from one year to the next where, you can charge that much. You just can't raise the price 200% from one year to the next without giving the homeowners a chance to try to keep up with it or make alternative plans. So at least that's one of the issues we've got in Florida is just every year it's going up by so much that people, they don't even have a chance to sell or move or whatever it is,
Yeah. And I think, so focusing on, like where do you look in those immediate times, right? Like, so that's why I don't know. I do think for the amount of money, I just did my taxes. so for the amount of money we pay in state and federal taxes in California, that's where it's like, well, what are my tax dollars going towards? Especially property taxes. I pay a lot in property taxes, and you know, I own in LA City, so I own in the city of LA, and I pay a lot of money in this, you know, in property taxes alone. And it's like, well, then what am I putting? If I'm putting all this money in, what am I getting out of it? You know. And so, and the other issue from a local standpoint that's going to be a huge problem with rebuilding is that the reason, and I don't know how it is in other states, but it's really, really difficult to get permits to rebuild in those areas. So what I'm finding is I had a dinner with a friend, a family, a close friend, and her aunt has a home in the Palisades, who their home wasn't completely destroyed. They have damage, but their home is still standing, and they're one of the only homes that are still standing. But they're displaced because there's no power, there's no gas. There's nothing around it. Schools are burned down, all that stuff. And then they were talking about like that their neighbors are just taking the money and buying somewhere else because it will take years to rebuild. Because even to get the permits, it would take years to get the permits to even start the construction to build. And so that's one thing where I'm like, we got to learn how to streamline that process. Like, why, when an entire city is burned down, you're going to then give people a hard time to get a permit to rebuild, and that whole bureaucracy. That's why people get frustrated with the government. And I think that's what I'm seeing in my end. And I remember after Katrina, I went to training in Biloxi, and the same thing. You just had these plots of houses that had been lost, and folks couldn't rebuild because they couldn't even get the approvals to go ahead and rebuild. So that's why you see it took people 5 and 10 years to rebuild. What are you supposed to do during that time?
Will,
so
what are you
think
seeing?
That is the tension.
Sorry, Thea. I was going to ask Will, since you just had the hurricane come through a couple months ago, what are you seeing in Florida being a red state? Theoretically, based on our political ideologies, you would imagine the red state would have less red tape to get permits to rebuild than you would have in a Democrat state. Are you seeing that, or are you seeing it's taken people a long time to get the permits to rebuild?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, we were not nearly as destroyed as LA, right? Like we had flooding, we had some homes destroyed, but it by and large nowhere near like LA. But we are finding the same kind of just bureaucratic delays, and one of the things I wanted to bring up is like in the immediate aftermath, when we're asking FEMA to like hurry up and get there and provide aid, we consciously sacrifice accuracy for speed. So the article that was out about, there was a $1 billion aid and it was justified by a single piece of paper proposal, right? Like, if we had forced someone to do a 100-page proposal in the heat of the disaster, we would have talked about how FEMA is not responsive enough. So we purposely make it easier, quicker to hurry up and get the aid there, knowing that it's not going to be accurate. There will be waste, some amount of waste. And we sacrifice that in the name of doing it quickly. And I think what we see then is this pendulum of, okay, once the disaster has passed and we're in the rebuilding phase, then everyone kind of takes a step back and slows down. And they're like, okay, now that no one's in immediate danger, they're displaced, they don't have their home or the school or whatever it may be. But now we can take a year to do the permitting paperwork so that we can, now move forward in the correct way. So, and I don't know, like I said, if we didn't do that, we would say FEMA wasn't responsive enough in the immediate aftermath. And if we tried to speed up the rebuilding, at some point something's gonna happen because they didn't get the permit, they didn't build it to code, and then we're gonna complain that it's because you went too fast in the rebuilding phase.
Well, one of the things I thought about, and I've seen this, dealing with permitting. So it's like, on the one hand, you're like, well, we want to speed up the process and let folks rebuild, but and then everyone's kind of conscientious about fire in California, but one of the biggest issues with building codes in California is actually the earthquake standards, right? And so it's like, we could focus on let these people rebuild and we want to loosen standards, and then when that 6.0 hits LA, then we're like, how come these homes weren't built to standards? How come there wasn't enforcement of this? How, you know what I mean? So I get the tension, but at the same time, you have real people just trying to, to figure out how to live and how to deal with these disasters as they hit. And here, it was just such a high profile disaster. But it, like you said, hurricanes, tornadoes. I have a cousin who works for FEMA, and he's all over the place. And he, a lot of times it's flooding he's responding to. So parts of the country we didn't even know had a major flood. Oklahoma had a flood, and next thing you know, he's in Oklahoma helping people. So I do think that FEMA is one of the only organizations that has that rapid response that Will is talking about, similar to the military. We know how quickly we can move. Most other organizations couldn't move as fast as we did, and how much it took to make that happen. But then the question is, it can't just be FEMA. It has to be in conjunction with the local governments. And there has to be, when it's a crisis, it has to be all hands on deck, focused on helping people, and the politics have to be removed from it. And that's where I was like, my toleration for seeing two Democrats argue about whether firefighters got paid for overtime 6 months ago, it was just not there, during the fires. And we've seen other examples during disasters where it becomes about politics. And I just think that's not right.
Yeah. I mean, my thoughts would be kind of like looking at just in general with the response to stuff. I mean, one, Will, to your point, it seems like people just like to complain, right? They're going to find fault with something and just find some way to whine about it. That's an issue unto itself, right? But then when we see these responses that seem to take so long because of all this bureaucratic tape, this is to me where really our funding should go to, is people that are forward thinking enough to look at, okay, what situations could happen and how can we plan for stuff? So Thea, to your point, you have an area that is prone to wildfires, right? It's a known thing. This isn't something new. It's not like this first fire that California's had. And you also know that earthquakes are a possibility. So if that's the case, then someone should be thinking ahead enough to know, okay, these codes have to be here. If a fire happens, this is how we respond. That, maybe it's not something you do all the time, but there should be some type of a process that you can kind of pull out and dust off and say, okay, this is what we need to do to get us back on track quickly and properly, right? Yeah. Because one of the issues that you're going to have with any situation, I mean, being in business, I know this, right? You have three options. You can either have quality, speed, or cost. The only thing is you can only pick two, right? You don't get all three. That's just kind of how it goes. And so we have to balance that. But this is where I really think making sure that the local governments are stepping up first, right? It should really be state and local leadership first. They're the ones that are handling it because they know the specifics of the area that we live in. Right. California, they know the needs, and those needs are different than Florida, then they're different from DC and Ohio, where we all live. And so they have that understanding of what needs to go into it. They also understand the cost to fix and repair and respond and do those things. But having a support group like FEMA or something like that, I think is also necessary, because you do need a larger response sometime. But when they come in, I don't know how this is. I've never been through a natural disaster. Thankfully, the two locations I've lived in my life were Tucson, Arizona, where, it's hot, but there's no real natural disasters come through. And then Ohio, the worst we get is a light ice storm, right? So
didn't like the worst tornado in like all of history hit in Miami?
Xenia. So yeah,
Xenia.
not too far.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we do have the occasional tornado. They're not bad. Actually, 2019, we had a tornado that was a mile from our house. We got a little bit of hail damage, and that was about it. But there were places nearby that, it just, you saw the trees. There was a V that just went through the areas of the trees. It was crazy. But again, in Ohio, we're prepared for that because we know that it comes up, right? So to me, I don't know, I'm just thinking about like, how do we fix this? How do we work forward to actually create an environment where this can be beneficial? And this goes back to the comments I made before is local government, right? One, know your representatives. Don't just know who the president and your congressman are. Actually know who your local representatives are so you can be involved with them and vote properly so they're following through on this kind of stuff and setting up what people actually need. But to me, it would almost be like, I don't know, I'm going to throw out, Republican curse word, I guess here, personal responsibility in that sense that communities need to prepare for the stuff that happens. Me as an individual, I have preparedness for my family and how I do stuff, right? And so I have money set aside for emergency funds and things of that nature. Now, it would be great if my neighbors also set up the exact same way and were prepared for their own emergencies that came up. But let's say that I get overwhelmed and it's something beyond my capability. That's where I would hope that I could lean on my community and say, hey, I'm in a pinch. I need some help. And that they would lean in and help me just as I would help them in the same way. And so to me, that's how our communities should operate, is that you have a city that can operate on its own. But if they can't, maybe neighboring cities can help. And if that's not enough, then you go to the state level and then there's help that's there. And then, of course, you have the federal that can come in. But that kind of communication needs to be able to happening. Thea, you were mentioning the cities where you've got fires that are jumping jurisdictions, right? Well, in that instance, my thought is that, okay, fire has no boundaries. So these cities should have been communicating with each other ahead of time.
Were. That's what I was saying. Yeah. That's what I was saying. I have a friend whose husband is a firefighter, and that was one thing. So like the fire department by my house, they were some of the first to respond, to the Palisades fires, right? Like immediately from like Manhattan Beach, they're going straight up to the Palisades, right? Even though because it's county fire. So it's all of the counties. But what you're seeing, I think what you're saying, I actually have seen in LA in a way that's made me really proud, right? As far as the amount of nonprofits, the amount of like community engagement in responding in the aftermath to the folks that were impacted by the fire. I don't think I've ever been more proud to be an Angelino in that sense. I do think the community has responded, but I also think like this was an apocalyptic level. I don't know. I've thought a lot about it. And I remember the Northridge earthquake when I was a kid. There are certain things that when they hit, I don't know how you prepare for it, right? Because in that sense, yes, we have wildfires, but what made these fires so notable is that typically you don't see them coming into such urban areas, right? The winds were 80-mile-an-hour winds. So you had fires blowing into areas that were no longer in the wild, right? Or it's in the city. The city got hit now. And so I don't know if you plan for 80-mile-an-hour winds going on with fire under perfect dry conditions, and so I think you do get to these apocalyptic levels. Like if a 6.0, 6.5 earthquake hits tomorrow, there's only so much preparedness that you could have done. Like hopefully my house is built to code and but at some point the big earthquake is still going to tear it down. Right. And then the question becomes when everybody is being devastated or so many people are impacted, you overwhelm the community's resources, which is what I think we see now where you have had the community coming in, but the resources are still overwhelmed. And this is a city like LA where we can absorb a lot, right? We have a lot of money that has gone in, that's set aside for different funds and different things. And we're really well resourced and we still were overwhelmed. People are talking about water, and the whole issue of like water and responding to the fires. And I kind of laughed because if it weren't for the 80 mile-an-hour winds, like part of why you don't prepare necessarily for using city waters to respond to this amount of fires is because you have the ocean. The ocean was right there, right? Like the ocean is there. That's normally the water. You see the planes go in and scoop up the water and drop it on the fires. That's normally a big part of the response to these wildfires. But in this instance, that wasn't a resource we were able to use. And then you had so many fires at the same time affecting, multiple areas so it was just the system got overwhelmed. But I think when that happens, we have to be able to have that, like you said, Brett, that cohesion across government levels and realize, okay, now we're at a point where, even California, as much money as we have, needs help from the government. And so one thing I did want to bring up is though, I think I don't agree with the idea that, that you would condition relief on there's conditions that should be put on reliefs to different states. So one of the things in the aftermath was this idea that in order for California to get certain funding and certain disaster relief, that, that there was going to be conditions placed on any funding. And I don't agree with that for any place, and that's something that I'm seeing a trend, this idea that even if you fail to prepare as much as you should have, I don't think you punish the people. I think there's a better way to go about doing that.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd throw that out to the group.
And there are as we're rebuilding, we've been talking about the codes and everything. I mean, there are certain levels of government that are talking about some of the delay in the rebuilding because of the permits and the coding is because they're talking about updating the codes. Like, okay, well, that, maybe we need to make the code stronger based on what we just saw. And that's delaying the permits. But Brett, to your point, I want to say that, I think you overestimate the empathy of people that would, freely give their aid to their neighbor. I am a pessimist, but I think that there's far too many people out there that would be like, not my problem. I'm not going to give up. I did it right. I saved up my thing. I prepared myself. Why do I have to go help those other people? They would want to keep it to themselves. If everyone was the way that you're describing, then I think the whole country would be in a very different place right now.
And I am a bit of an idealist when it comes to that kind of stuff, Will, but that's the reason I talk about it, because I want to push those ideals out so that people are aware of them and they think about them. That's my whole. I've talked with Dion about this. This is one of my whole reasons of being on this podcast is I want to help change the way that people think about stuff. I'm not trying to get people to change, what side of the aisle they vote on. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, fundamentally change the way they think about approaching government in a get-go. And a lot of that starts with realizing that we're people first. Right? That you have to start from that level, that your neighbors are people, that your community is made of people. It's not just others, right? That's the whole thing. And I mean, there's a whole thing I could go on about that in terms of the constant divide that we're put into, that people always bring up the us versus them in some way, that we're always put into that box, that it's the other. Because when you see someone as less than human, it's so much easier to just demean them in any way that you can, or not offer help, because why would you, right? But when you start to treat people as people, and that they're humans and they have problems and they have flaws and that nobody's perfect, but they make mistakes, but hey, we're here to help each other. That changes the way that we approach stuff. And so, I'm a bit of an idealist, and I look at our world today, and no, I don't think that most people actually would follow through on what I say, but I have hope, right? And that's where I put that, is to say that this is a potential solution, that if we start changing the way people think about stuff, we can start to implement systems that it's not going to protect us from everything, because you can't stop bad things from happening. Fires are still going to happen. You're still going to have these apocalyptic level events that occur. And there's stuff that you just can't prepare for. But that doesn't mean that you can't have your heart in the right place going into it, right? And if you're forward-thinking enough, you can establish the government in a way that is actually beneficial to people, that you have an effective response as best as you can. And that's, like I said, my kind of hope with that. And I know it's a little pie in the sky. It's a little Pollyanna, which is probably a very outdated reference for most people. But
I take your point. I mean, that's 100%. One of the instances I'm thinking of, right, is one of the big critiques against FEMA was there was this report that they were skipping houses that had Trump MAGA signs out front, right? And when they dug into it, it wasn't necessarily wrong. It was, that was somewhat accurate reporting. But it was that, Trump was out there saying that FEMA was doing such a horrible job and they weren't doing anything, that when FEMA went to certain people's houses, they were being verbally and physically attacked. So yeah, at some point they were like, all right, guys, we're not getting paid enough to suffer this kind of abuse. So they started skipping some of those houses, and that it's wrong, right? Like FEMA should help everybody equally, but when, to your point, when that kind of divide is out there, and when there's people out there saying that, FEMA sucks and they're not doing anything, when the people on the ground, I mean, I don't want to speak for Thea, but for Thea and myself, I mean, like we see them doing everything they can, and they're not perfect, but as I mentioned earlier, I think we knowingly sacrifice the accuracy for the speed, and the cost as well. We talk about like it would cost like 25% more to just make sure that it gets done quickly. We know that we could get it done cheaper. But yeah, I mean, I wish it was like that,
Well, so this is probably a good point for us to talk about what we think should be the role of the federal government. Not necessarily.
Real quick, Dion, could I respond real quick to something Brett said that I think is important? When you talked about like seeing your neighbors as people, I also think that what gets lost in this conversation is this idea that people are deserving of the help, and that we put conditions on who we think deserves to be supported and who doesn't deserve to be supported, and that's where the polarization comes in, and us versus them. And I think that because we place these barriers, then it's like, I don't see you, you may be my neighbor, but I don't know if you deserve it as much as I would deserve it, or as much as this other person deserves it. There's like a lack of worthiness, we think, when it comes to it. And so that's, I think, it's in the way of what you're describing. And that is frustrating. I haven't seen that here in LA, but maybe it's because we overall aren't as polarized as other parts of the country. So like what you're describing, Will, you wouldn't have had like, as many, Trump MAGA signs or something. And I mean, even if they existed in yards, those signs were burnt there. I guess maybe there's no way of telling who was who in the aftermath of the disaster. So maybe FEMA had no way of knowing who was who. But I think that's a big problem, because then, one of the things the government, we want them to do is just treat us all fairly and not do these value-based, assessments of who deserves the help versus who doesn't. And I think that's a big thing. And when you're planning, also giving the same amount of resources to help people, plan ahead or prepare so that when these disasters happen, then they can help themselves, and I think all of that gets muddied in the water. So,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of issues that kind of pull up on that, Thea, because, you talk again, I come back to personal responsibility. My thought would be, living in an area that has the potential for a disaster, there's a level of preparedness you're going to have to take that is above someone who doesn't live in that area. So whether that's setting money aside or setting up proper funds or finding an insurance company that will cover you, or even having the conversation of, well, maybe we can't afford to live here, right? Making those kind of choices, it's never easy. And I'm not saying that it is, but it just requires a different level of thought process. But to your point, Thea, where we're limiting aid based on qualifiers, that stuff irritates me, because that is just not a proper response to stuff. Again, in my opinion, it's one of those that, everybody talks about, backgrounds and race and demographics and stuff. Like, for me, there's one race. There's the human race, right? We're all here. We're all in the same fight. We all have problems. We all deal with stuff. So that idea of helping your neighbor and being willing to step in, I wish it was more prevalent. My only solution for that is, stop listening to us or any of the other pundits that are out there and go talk to your neighbors, have a conversation, get involved with your community and know people. Because then you'll find that if you actually talk with your neighbors and know a little bit about their life, you're probably a lot more willing to step in and help, because you realize that they are people. But when all you have is your filter through social media or through the media networks, unfortunately, it's always biased. It's always colored. And you never get that full picture of who's actually there. But coming back around to what Dion was saying about what the role of the federal government should be, I kind of stated earlier, but my thoughts on it is that it should start with state and local governments first, that they should have sort of the overarching plan for stuff. The federal government should be there as a resource, not to replace, but to support state and local efforts. But I also think that it should be the funding line is limited in effect, maybe not limited by dollar amount, but maybe limited by time. And that's going to, of course, change by whatever event is happening and the level that happens. If you have a Cat 3 hurricane that comes through versus a Cat 5, well, the Cat 5 is going to do a lot more damage, right? So probably your response needs to be longer. There needs to be more money tied to it.
Do we think that's not happening now?
I was going to say, isn't that the role now? Like, don't the governors have to request the federal assistance? Like they assess whether they can handle it on their own at the state level. And then they request federal aid, because wasn't there a governor who was complaining about FEMA not helping, and then it turns out he never requested the help?
I'm not sure about that one, but yeah, as far as I know, that is the process, is that the state are supposed to step in to do that more. So I think probably where we end up with is, how does FEMA respond? Where does FEMA's funds come from? What kind of funding do they have available? Should things be moved around or changed? Where should the funding go to start with? These are all things that I don't really know, but
should people in like Utah, which I don't think encounters a whole lot of natural disasters, be paying for people in Florida, Texas, Mississippi, California, Hawaii that do encounter a lot of natural disasters, right? I think most of the natural disasters that we see are Gulf Coast related. It's most often like hurricane.
Yeah, but I think that whenever that framing is, when we talk about how taxpayer dollars are allocated, there's also it's not an accurate statement, right? So again, I'll use California. We pay more taxes. We put way more money into the federal government than we take out as a state by far. Okay. And so even if Utah taxpayers put in some money, and now California is now in this one instance taking, going to need funding from FEMA, there's a lot of things that Californians are paying into that we don't benefit from in the same way either. You know what I mean? So it's part of being a United States, right? We know that there's going to be give and take in the Republic as far as different states contributing different amounts. So that's where I have a hard time with even trying to say, well, is it going to somehow always equal out when it comes just to the cost? Because again, you have a state, no state is better funded than California, right? We're one of the largest economies in the world, right? And we were even, again, here it is a state that has all this money, that has programs and had funding for these types of reliefs, right? So part of why you already had these standing agreements across all these fire departments is because that was in the preparedness plan. There was a lot of things that were done as right as they could be, right? But again, even a state that has all this money aside, had all these programs, they supplement insurance, there's all these things that are already in place, and it still got overwhelmed. So then the question is, when we talk about, what should FEMA respond to what extent, once the system is overwhelmed at the state and local level, I do think that's when we look to the federal government, right? In the same way that if China tomorrow decided to attack San Francisco, I would hope someone in Utah wouldn't be like, well, are we really going to pay for the defense of San Francisco? Like, you know what I mean? Or someone in Maine is like, well, that's really far.
Kind of interesting that you bring that up. And I don't want to derail us, but I will mention there. So with the southern border, I feel like there were a lot of like northern states that were kind of like, it's not really our problem. Like they could deal with it down there. So I feel like that sort of sentiment has come up in other realms. I think, like you said, like when Pearl Harbor was bombed, I don't think a whole lot of Americans were like, whatever, let them deal with that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we have seen situations across the nation where people in certain states are like, that's really kind of a them problem, not us. Like, why are our taxpayer dollars going towards that? And that's probably, like, again, that's kind of what we're here discussing is like, I kind of feel like the national defense, promoting the general welfare, that kind of stuff that's kind of in the preamble of the Constitution, kind of sets the stage for we are a United States, right? We are not 50 independent states. We are the United States of America, and there are certain things that we should do as a group. I do tend to think, and this probably alienates me from some of my fellow libertarians, and I apologize to that, you guys that are out there listening, but I do think this is probably one of those things that the federal government probably needs to be there for is some level of disaster preparedness and relief. The question, though, is how much should they be involved in the before and the after, right? I think the during, we've kind of touched on it, but I just want to like tie it up real quick and make sure that maybe I heard everybody correctly and we're on the same page. It seems like the during the disaster, really you're leaning on your local and state, right? Because those are the people that are there to help you immediately right then. The before, I don't know if it's like the federal government leaning in and helping with planning, with resources, with that kind of thing. And then the after, is it them bringing in resources and people? Is it them helping streamline whatever bureaucratic nonsense goes on? What are the things that we were expecting from the federal government?
Well, and so for the after part, my experience with FEMA is that FEMA goes directly to the individual that needs the help. I mean, it is a relatively onerous red tape, assistance portal that you have to put in all these documents for it. But then at some point, FEMA just cuts you as an individual the check. They reimburse you for the hotel costs when you're displaced. They, so I mean, as we're talking about like the role of FEMA and at what level they should be involved, my experience in the aftermath is that they go directly to the source, to the lowest possible level, right to the individual.
Well, then I would ask you, Will, since you have kind of firsthand experience with it, was it adequate and useful? And do you feel like you got your money's worth out of the taxpayer dollars you paid into that?
Yeah, it ends up opening a can of worms about just the overall insurance situation, especially in Florida. To your earlier point about Utah not helping California, I mean, it's FEMA is in a way an insurance policy that everyone pays into it, and whoever it is that gets hurt, gets the response. And if you happen to be one of the ones that never gets hurt, just like your own personal insurance or your homeowner's insurance, you keep paying into it just in case something happens, and yeah, I mean, it's designed to supplement the insurance that you already have on your home. So, you go through your own insurance company and you pay your deductible and you go through that process. But then there are inevitably gaps when, if you're underinsured or even uninsured. And yeah, I mean, it was, there was bureaucracy and red tape, but within 2 months I had a check. So yeah, I mean, it worked well enough for me, but I could also see how it would be a little more difficult for others.
Well, how would you improve it then for the others?
It goes back to that earlier discussion about like you sacrifice speed for accuracy, right? And in the aftermath, everything slows down so that they can be as accurate as they can. And FEMA sent an individual inspector to my house to inspect everything that was damaged. And, I can only imagine now you multiply that by how many states got hit with these hurricanes and how many households got hit. It slowed things down. But I think at that point you would want them being a little more accurate in how much they cut me a check for so that they don't send me $1 billion just to make it quick.
Yeah. And I think the issue it like the way you framed it, Dion, was good. But I think the reality is the same way that in the preparedness phase, you look to the local government to kind of really be the ones on the ground looking to assist the people and figure out how we can prevent certain things. I think in the aftermath, the same becomes true after the more time that goes on past the disaster. And I think it's a complicated conversation, though, because of the need, of that local governments have other things that they're also doing at the same time. And so it's, can we walk and chew gum, and I think that's where you start to see, like, I think especially for the preparedness, there's a lot of things you can do to prepare for disasters, but quite often that's not what municipalities are putting their money towards, because there's other things that are bigger priorities, right? So that to spend all the extra money to try to be even more prepared, it tends to get on the cutting room floor, and that's something that I've seen a lot. And, and then even Brett, to what you talked about, as far as like, okay, well, you're living in these areas, these are communities that were built, maybe before some of the conditions have changed, right? So I don't want to get into a climate change discussion, but, there's communities that were built that 100 years ago didn't seem to be the same threats existed that do today, right? And but these people, they're living there, this is their livelihood, that they're not in a position to move. So they just are kind of trying to figure out how to make it work. And then the local government doesn't have the money to necessarily invest in certain types of infrastructure changes and all that to help prepare for a disaster. And in the aftermath, resources are still limited. So I think one of the issues, Dion, that I think is something we need to talk, or that, we didn't talk about, or that comes to mind, is like the long-term support of like FEMA and the federal government in like the rebuilding efforts that you see. Like, I remember with the levees, wasn't it the Corps of Engineers that went in and for years were working on the levees outside of New Orleans? So it wasn't like a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or 4 year project after Katrina. It took years to kind of rebuild that. And that was the federal, again, that you had federal assistance in that. And so I do think that's the role. That's what I would expect from the federal government. But I feel like lately that's something that people think is above and beyond, or not what it should be doing, or the cost is too high for that.
So one thing that I want to bring up as a libertarian is there is there's always the potential that if government doesn't do this, somebody else could. And that's with everything. It may not be the best solution, but it is always a possibility, right? So for instance, like people bring up, we could just not have a military and we could just contract it out to like BlackRock and just, whatever, right? I think most of us would say, that's probably a bad idea. But it is a possibility. And so one of the things that I was thinking about is we could potentially do away with FEMA as it exists today and maybe replace it, at least from the funding standpoint, with so instead of having a federal agency that comes and 2 months later gives you a check, maybe everybody has like a national disaster insurance like portion of their, whether they have homeowners insurance or renters insurance, whatever it is, right? There's a natural disaster specific like coverage as part of that. So like I don't live in a floodplain, but I didn't live in a floodplain when I was in Colorado Springs, and I was subjected to 2 floods while I was there. So I actually have flood insurance now on my house, right? Just because I'm like, you know what? You just never know when something like that's going to happen. Maybe like we replace the funding aspect of FEMA with like a natural disaster insurance kind of thing.
I think that already exists. Like, for example, earthquake insurance in California is a whole separate category of insurance, right? So, and it's very expensive, and so all of that, it's not covered necessarily in just a regular homeowner's policy. Like earthquake insurance is its own thing. And I think that's for what you're describing, right? Because we understand if a big earthquake hits, the level of devastation is beyond what you normally would have in what normal insurance policy is designed to cover. So I don't know, but I just don't know if it's enough. And I can tell you, not everybody can afford it, right? And so with the cost
again, the libertarian.
So the libertarian you're saying don't pay taxes, pay into the policy?
Yeah, if you had a reduction in taxes, but then you could put that
gotcha.
Right. So It's not
Okay.
always one-to-one. I get that. But,
Okay.
we're thinking along sort of ideological, theoretical lines here. If we
That
could
makes sense.
reduce
Okay.
what we pay in taxes to the federal government and instead turn that money towards the things that we want to choose to pay into. I had an interesting discussion with my mom last night about trying to save people from their own stupidity. So it would naturally come up, well, what if somebody lives right on the fault line and decides not to buy earthquake insurance? And it's like, well, you can't fix stupid, right? So,
But again, it comes back to the expense, right? Like, I really had a serious conversation with my parents this last year about how much their insurance went up, their homeowners insurance went up. And my parents are now retired. And so when those premiums went up, it really affected them in ways that in the past it may not have. They may not have noticed as much. And it was a whole talk with my mom about what are we going to do? Should we change carriers? And, and all that. And I realized and that was before the fires. This was just a conversation that happened last fall because Palm Springs the year before it had mudslides and flooding and all that kind of stuff. And so their premiums are going up. So it is a real conversation, but I do think there's limits to, and I'm not the personal responsibility person on this podcast, but I do think that even when people want to take responsibility and they want to help themselves, there's times where it just is beyond their capacity to do so.
Well, and Dion, to your point that it's not a one-to-one match, I mean, is it possible to go that route? Sure, but it's going to end up being more expensive because not everyone pays into it.
Yeah, I personally think a blanket solution like that's not the answer. Central planning rarely leads to the right answer. Anytime, again, we are the United States, but there are 50 different states with different, climate aspects, different people, different cultures, a lot of things that play into it. If you try to make one policy that fits across everybody, it just won't, right? The one size fit all doesn't
but isn't
work.
that kind of what FEMA is from the financial aspect? I realize that there's more to FEMA than just paying out checks, but at this point, I'm just talking about the financial aspect of reimbursing people for their emergency expenses. That is essentially insurance. And what we've done is we've created a central bureaucracy solution for the entire 50 states, which is FEMA.
Yeah, I mean, there's other potential solutions too. I mean, the answers that we've basically tossed around at this point is well, the people have to pay in something, right? Well, I mean, there's other options that are there. When you look at federally funded sources, yes, the federal government doesn't produce income of its own, but there are ways that the federal government can bring in dollars. I know, not changing topics, tariffs. But, the tariffs is a hot button right now with everybody, and people understanding those and how that works. And yes, it always comes down to, yes, the consumer pays more in the end. Got it. Okay. That argument gets beat down. But the point being is that there is a way, as an option, right? I'm not saying it's the only option. It's not the best option, right? But it's a potential option. And this is where the discussion comes around to, okay, what is the most effective way that we can approach this? Right. And it's something, you can always look at it and say well, is this effective? Is it ineffective? Can it be more effective? All those kind of things where you look at it, you can be evaluative of the situation and find out, is there a different way to do this? And some of that requires out of the box thinking. So maybe people paying into it is the way to go. But if that's the case, then maybe that gets adjusted based on where you live, right? If you live in an area that tend to be prone to more natural disasters, well, then maybe the percentage you pay in is higher. Just like with an insurance premium, right?
I guess the issue is I feel like I already am doing that, because I'm paying California taxes, right? And I'm paying property taxes, and I'm paying higher tax in California than Will is in Florida, right?
The argument,
so I'm already.
The argument is going to be that's because you live in a blue state. Right?
I kind of feel like maybe you're making my argument for me, Thea, is that you're paying a lot of money to an ineffective solution.
No, I don't think it's so I'll push back. I will stand up for California in that, like I said, the fires are a bad example because it's so apocalyptic, the level of damage that happened, right? But I think ordinarily, as a state, this is a state that does provide a lot of assistance to the people without having to reach outside resources across the board for a myriad of things, right? For example, my kids get free school lunches because California provides free school lunches across the board, regardless of income. So I live in a nice area. my kids go to nice schools and they get free lunch. I appreciate that. Right. And that's part of California, things that California has budgeted. That comes from the state, right? Not individual school districts. So I want to emphasize that, yes, we pay a lot of taxes, but it does come back to us in a lot of ways. And I'm okay with that. But when we're talking about like a city burns to the ground and everything in it's gone, including the revenue from sales taxes and all the businesses that were lost, right? It's not just people losing their homes, and then, like I said, schools are gone, churches are gone, like whole communities are gone. That just takes a huge amount of resources to figure out, if they're going to rebuild, then how do you rebuild? And then the history of, so I think I've heard a lot of people say, well, then don't rebuild. And those people can, but, people don't, people are, that's their home, and so I can't look at someone and say, well, and then especially Altadena, the history of that area, like, I don't know, it just breaks my heart, the idea that it's just gone forever. You know what I mean? And so
I think to Brett's point, so Florida might be a better example of, we are prone to hurricanes. Should people in Florida pay higher taxes than they currently do because we are a red state and, in general, taxes are kept quite low. So should Florida pay higher taxes to help pay for our own hurricane issues that we have?
Well, a quick differentiation that I think is important too. Are we talking state taxes or federal taxes?
Well, Florida doesn't have any state taxes. So should we?
That's why I use them. They don't pay state taxes.
No.
So
should we have a state tax simply for hurricanes? But I don't know. I mean, it seems like it's a slippery slope, though. If you're going to increase taxes on certain people based on where they live, I mean, they're already doing that with insurance, so I don't know.
Well, this again comes back to the discussion. Should this be a privately handled issue or a governmental issue? Right. Again, there's no one size fits all with any of this. And so this is where I think states can kind of choose how they want to handle this sort of stuff. But the point we've kind of been talking about is that the federal government should have some program in place to be able to assist, right, to support the states and the communities when things do happen. The question comes down to it, how do you fund it, right? And that seems to be really the crux of the discussion is, where does the money come to provide this pot of money for people?
Yeah. And I guess I see this as an example of why private industry is not the thing you can rely on, because it's not cost effective for them to be the ones to step in. So they're not. We talked about the cynicism of helping your neighbor. I'll say the cynicism of corporate America. If it's not profitable, they're not gonna do it. And it's not profitable right now to really be able to put in the amount of money without charging the end user or the consumer way more money than they could afford to pay. So I don't think the solution comes in private industry. There can be partnerships, but I really do think this is one of the times where you're looking to government and having government figure out an efficient way to step in and fill those gaps.
So I'm aware of the time. We've gone a little bit over an hour already. I feel like we at least have a consensus that there is a role for a federal level agency to help with disaster preparedness and response. I think even the Libertarian and the Republican have agreed that these are things that benefit from the size and scope of the federal government and help all 50 states. But maybe there is room for improvement in how we fund it and how we operate it, which we probably will have to kick to another podcast episode. But Brett, what has been making you happy lately?
So I had a chance to think about this one earlier, and I don't know, it's something fun for me. So some friends of ours, they just found out that they're having a baby. A lot of stuff that makes me happy is around kids and family. That's just how it is. But what specifically made me happy about this one is that I got a chance to design a baby blanket for them, which I think is really cool. So for anybody that doesn't know, one of my businesses that I have is I do graphic design. It's kind of a hobby business, but I got a chance to do this. And so it was just kind of a cool thing because he's originally from Ohio. They currently live in Texas. Obviously, it's the United States. And then she's from France. Well, all four of the flags are red, white, and blue. And so I got to do a design theme around that. It was basically just, it's love for the red, white, and blue. And I did it in English and in French on the blanket. And I just sent that to them. They're supposed to get it this upcoming week. But that just brings me joy. It was just fun putting effort into a personal project for a friend of mine.
That's cool.
Thea?
So as our audience knows, we're all former Air Force. And so when you're in the military, you move around a lot. And over the years, you pick up friends at different stages in your life, different assignments or whatever. And I have like my best friend from my first assignment. I'm still very close to her. Her family live in Destin, Florida. And one of my high school best friends, she's in South Carolina. And over the years, I guess I've introduced them. And so what's making me happy is it hit me this year. I want to kind of make more of an effort to like see my friends and reconnect with them since we're so far apart. And my South Carolina friend was like, why don't we go to Florida and visit her? And like, I was like, you guys, like, so now we're planning a big, we're going to all take our families and meet in Destin and do like a vacation this summer. And it made me really happy to think like two people that had no ties. And now we've like formed this community of folks and we can get together and look forward to like having all our kids, have fun. And my friend in Florida, her husband just retired, and so they have a boat. We're going to go fishing and we're planning all this stuff. And it just is making me happy to realize like after all these years, like now that community is still part of my life. And we're at a point where we could just enjoy each other. And again, people who wouldn't have known each other now know each other through me. And so I was just really excited when my friend decided, she's like, let's go see, Chelsea is the one in Florida. She's like, why don't we go see Chelsea? And I was like, yeah. And so that made me really happy. So that's my
cool.
So I'm coming your way, Will, for the summer, but I'll be a little north of you, but yeah, coming down to Florida.
Hey, I'll be there.
Yeah.
I'll go on the boat with you. It's fine.
Yeah.
For me, for people who are listening to our episodes back to back, they're going to be like, wow, Dion, a lot of your stuff lately is about Harry Potter. But the trip to Universal Studios apparently kickstarted a love of Harry Potter in my son. Mm-hmm. And so we came back and we started, even though he's about to turn 9, we still read to him because it's a great bonding moment for us at night, right? So we started reading the Harry Potter books. And in particular, I mean, that in itself has been very joyful for us. It's great, like especially rereading them now, because the last time I read them, I didn't have kids. And oh man, I got to tell you, like the part at the end of Goblet of Fire, spoilers for anybody who has not read or seen the movie, right? I know it's been like 15 years. So
you're past the statute of limitation on that, Dion. So
when Cedric Diggory's dad is just lamenting his death, right? And he's like, my boy, my boy,
my boy.
Like now being a father, like I felt that. I was like, oh man, I'm going to start crying. But in particular, so we have been switching off between reading and then like my son cannot get enough of it. So we got the Audible books because I have a subscription. We get credits. Well, we ran out of credits. And we needed the next book. And I looked and I was like, kiddo, they want to charge us like $35 per book if we just buy it outright instead of getting the free credits we get every month. And he was like, well, when do we get the free credits? And I was like, oh, it looks like not until the end of the month, like on the 28th. And he was like, I can't wait that long. Like, what am I going to do? And he's like on the verge of tears. And I was like, I will figure something out. So it turns out you can buy 5 credits for $50. And I was like, okay, well, that comes out to like $10 per book instead of $35. I'll do that. Okay. So I got the rest of the collection on Audible so we can listen to it in the car when he wants to. But just the sheer like panic that he could not continue with his favorite book series. I was like, I know that feeling, kiddo. I'm not going to put you through that.
Wheel of time, man. 2 years between books.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so for mine, this is news for you all as well. I am now an officially filed candidate for office.
Congrats, man.
drove up
I
to
saw it on
Tallahassee. I haven't announced anything on Facebook. I've been dropping some heavy hints on Facebook, but drove up to Tallahassee last week, filed all the paperwork, and it's game on now. I'm Florida House of Representatives, District 67. It's an open seat. I'm the first one in the race. The election's in November of 2026. It's going to be a long year and like 8 months or whatever it is until then. But I'm excited. It's been a long time coming. I've always this is something I've wanted to do, and based on where I sit in this group of people, no surprise that I think Florida needs some help. So I'm here to help it. I like to say I got a lot of fight left in me. After my time in the military, so no, I'm excited. It's good. It's going to be a good time.
Well, for our listeners out there, if you happen to be in that district, as much as I ideologically and politically may disagree with Will, I also happen to find him to be a very logical, reasonable, and upstanding person. So I think you should vote for him.
Aw. Thanks, Dion. and I think that you also should vote for me and not waste your vote on the Libertarians. No, I mean you vote however you want. It's fine. All right, everyone. That's our episode for this week. Please like and subscribe and share this with your friends. We really do. Obviously, we all have disagreements and different positions on a lot of these policies, but we are all, as Brett said, members of the human race. We all want what's best for everybody, and we hope that our disagreements can help inform your decisions. So we will see you again next week. Have a good one.